In fighting, a chin is something that you either have or you don't. Unlike your skills or your strength or your physique, your ability to take a blow to the head without going unconscious is an attribute that cannot really be improved. On the contrary, a fighter's chin declines with age and accumulated damage, with every strike to the head and every KO leading to becoming more and more fragile. As it is often said nowadays, a chin is like a dry cell battery. It starts off at full, gets drained over time, and eventually ends up at empty with no way of being recharged. And sure, maybe you can train your neck muscles for some minor improvements maybe, but in the end, fighters who have a bad chin simply have to deal with constantly being on 1 HP. As I've said in the past, fighting in the UFC while having a bad chin is like doing a hitless run of the entire Soulsborne series, including Sekiro and the entire Elden Ring DLC, with your eyes closed. And when discussions about the worst chins in the UFC happen, we often talk about fighters who have already retired or been cut from the UFC, like Alistair Overeem or James Vick. However, who are the fighters who are currently in the UFC who have the worst chins? Well, I've scoured through Tapology and watched a bunch of highlight reels to give you all an answer to that question. So in this video, I'll be going through the 10 worst chins in the UFC today, going in order from the least worst of the bunch to the most fragile glass jaw on the roster today. But before I get into the list, I want to explain my criteria for determining who truly has a terrible chin. After thinking things through, I think it comes down to these 3 criteria. 1. The fighter's weight class. 2. The level of competition they're getting KO'd by. And 3. The kind of shots they're getting KO'd by. I think the part about a fighter's weight class is pretty self-explanatory. The heavier the weight class, the more power everybody has. That means that getting KO'd at a heavier weight class might just mean that a fighter's opponent has freakish power as opposed to him having a bad chin. The second is also important as well, as we've seen many times how a fighter who may look chinny against extremely good competition may look like they have a granite jaw against worse opponents. A great example of this is Yuri Prohaska, who got KO'd twice by Alex Pereira, with the second time being extremely brutal, but then went on to destroy Jamal Hill and Khalil Rountree Jr. without being dropped or even hurt all that much. Another example of this is Alexander Volkanovski, who everybody thought had lost his chin after his back-to-back losses against Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria, but then went on to dominate Diego Lopez over the course of 2 title bouts that went the distance. And sure, Diego did drop him, but if Volk had truly lost his chin, then he would have gotten KO'd, since Diego Lopez has demonstrated in the past that he has the power to put guys out. The third criteria is what kind of shots a guy is getting put out by, and I think this is pretty relevant too. Getting slept out cold by a head kick doesn't mean that a fighter has a bad chin. Neither does getting KO'd with a flying knee. But if you're going out cold from something like a jab, that's a sign of a bad chin. But that's enough with the intro, so let's get started with the list. So starting at number 10 on the list, there's Dominic Reyes. Now you guys might all be wondering why Reyes is relatively high on this list, in spite of the image of him getting brutally KO'd that is burned into your minds, but there's a few reasons why. First and foremost, Dominic Reyes is all the way up at light heavyweight, where everybody not named Paul Craig has some KO power in their hands. And second, you have to look at the competition that Reyes has been getting chinned by. Looking back at his first KO loss, which also happens to be the first actual loss of Reyes' career since he got robbed in his title fight against the closeted criminal champion of his division, but well, he got knocked out by Jan Blachowicz, and that is by no means a bad loss to take. Jan Blachowicz is one of the most underrated champions in recent UFC history, having been the one to take Israel Adesanya's undefeated record, taking Magomed Ankalaev to a split draw, and losing a close split decision against Alex Pereira that he could have had scored to him. While Jan Blachowicz has slowed down considerably in recent years because he's literally in his 40s now, getting knocked out by Jan in his prime doesn't mean that Reyes has a bad chin. And then you look at the second KO loss that Dominic Reyes had, which was to Yuri Prohaska by a spinning elbow. And getting KO'd like that by Yuri, who went on to become UFC champion and will be fighting for the belt again soon, who also has 28 wins by KO and has only ever been to decision once in his professional career, also does not mean that Dominic Reyes has a bad chin. However, the damage that Yuri inflicted on Dominic with that finish is the kind of damage that can permanently compromise a fighter's ability to take shots from that point onwards, and let me explain why. After the Yuri fight, it was revealed that Dominic Reyes had suffered multiple injuries to his skull. This included having both sides of his nasal bridge being fractured, the orbital medial wall of his right eye getting fractured and displaced, and an orbital zygomatic arch fracture, which is the part of the eye socket that connects to the cheekbone. And while if your skull is more smashed up after a fist fight than a zoomer who bone smashes to look smacks, you have likely sustained a lot of brain damage. And I think that Dominic Reyes' next fight, which he for some reason took just 6 months after that life-changing beating he took from Yuri, proves that. And now we come to the main reason why I have Dominic Reyes at 10th place for the worst chins in the UFC, and that is the KO loss to Ryan Spann. Now, I'm sure many of you already know this, but Ryan Spann is just not a great fighter. And to demonstrate why Spann isn't a top-tier fighter with a single fact, let me just remind all of my more casual viewers out there that Ryan Spann lost to Anthony Smith twice. And these losses were bad losses, because in the first fight, Spann got finished by Anthony Smith, and in the second fight, he lost a close split decision to Smith in 2023 when Mr. On Paper was already clearly on the decline. If you look through the entirety of Ryan Spann's resume, you would see that the only championship caliber win he has is the one over Reyes. Unless, of course, you count Spann's win over the washed-up 42-year-old ghost of Little Nog. And then the way that Reyes got put out by Spann shows just how badly Reyes' chin had deteriorated at that point. It was a jab that knocked Reyes out. A jab. And it wasn't a TKO or anything like that. No, Dominic was out completely cold. Even at the higher weight classes, fighters eat jabs off of each other all the time. And if you're getting put out by a jab, that means your chin is likely toast. And while Dominic Reyes did take a lot of time off after his loss to Spann and went on that little resurgent run where he KO'd Dustin Jacoby, Anthony Smith, and Nikita Krylov all 3 in a row, he got destroyed by Carlos Ulberg, where he was put out cold yet again. And look, getting put out by Ulberg isn't a terrible look either, since he is a title contender. But since Carlos Ulberg made it look pretty damn easy, it just shows that Dominic Reyes has really truly lost his chin. So moving on up the list to number 9, we have Jack Hermansson. Now, you guys might be a little startled to see Hermansson here, but there's a good reason why I have him here. So, throughout his UFC career, Jack Hermansson has suffered 5 losses by KO or TKO. The first was all the way back in 2017, where he got KO'd in the first round by Thiago Santos due to getting clipped during a blitz. And getting KO'd by Thiago Santos, a guy who arguably beat John Jones and also has 11 KO wins in the UFC, doesn't mean that your chin is bad. The second KO loss was to Jared Cannonier, another high-level guy and known power puncher who fought for the title and also has a win over Sean Strickland. The third was to Roman Dolidze, who isn't that good, but that was a TKO due to ground and pound, where Dolidze put Hermansson in a calf slicer and made it impossible for Jack to escape taking those shots. And the fourth KO loss was a flatline KO loss to Gregory Robocop Rodriguez, where Hermansson got clipped on the chin with a left hook. And that doesn't mean Jack has a bad chin either, since Robocop is probably one of the hardest punchers at middleweight. However, the main reason why I have Jack Hermansson at this spot on the list, and above Dominic Reyes, is the Muktabek Orolbai fight. In this fight, Hermansson, a former middleweight who has fought against guys like Thiago Santos who ended up competing at light heavyweight, got completely flatlined out cold by Muktabek Orolbai, a former lightweight. And now look, Orolbai was a huge 155er, and he moved up because he missed weight against Tafik Musayev. But Orolbai has never been some sort of crazy KO artist, and definitely wasn't one when he was down at lightweight, where he'd have a strength and power advantage. On the contrary, he went to a somewhat competitive decision against Elvis Brenner, and Muktabek Orolbai lost in a bloody war against Mateusz Rebecki, where Rebecki hurt and dropped Orolbai, while Orolbai, who was much bigger, failed to knock down Rebecki. So Muktabek Orolbai, who was failing to KO lightweights over the course of 3 rounds, went up 15 pounds and completely slept Hermansson. And this was a cold KO, with Jack going completely unconscious. And while the weight cut might have affected Jack's chin, the fact that he got absolutely dusted by an opponent who is failing to KO opponents who are likely 30 or maybe even 40 pounds lighter than him, just shows where his chin is at nowadays. And that is why Jack Hermansson is at number 9 on this list. Now at number 8, we have Matt Frevola. Matt Frevola, like Jack Hermansson, is a name that you might have not expected to see on this list, but there's a reason why he's here, and I'll explain why. First of all, Matt is currently coming off of 3 losses, with 2 of those being by KO. Although, as I'll explain in a bit, they should frankly all be by KO. And second, he's at lightweight, which is the middle of the pack when it comes to the UFC weight classes, and it's not a division where literally everybody has heat in their hands. Throughout his UFC career, Frevola has taken 4 official KO losses. The first was all the way back in 2018, where he suffered a 1-2 KO loss to Polo Reyes, a journeyman who is now no longer in the UFC. And while this is a bad loss to a lower level opponent, this was Frevola's UFC debut, the first loss he ever had, and the right straight that slipped in was placed perfectly. The second KO loss of Frevola's career was to Terrence McKinney, where McKinney chinned Frevola with, yet again, a 1-2 down the pipe 7 seconds into the first round. And while Terrence McKinney is a journeyman, he is incredibly fast and dangerous in the first round of a fight, with literally all but one of his wins coming in the first round. So getting KO'd by McKinney that early into a fight isn't too bad of a look for Matt's durability. But now, we get to the real damaging losses of Frevola's career, which are his losses to Benoit Saint-Denis and Fares Siam. In the Benoit fight, Frevola got his head punted into the stratosphere with a high kick, and in the Siam fight, Frevola got put out cold with a knee straight up the middle while in the clinch. And yeah, while these were brutal KO losses, these shots would also take out just about anybody. However, the same cannot be said for what happened in Frevola's most recent fight against the Canadian Kyle Nelson, a former featherweight who had just moved up to 155 pounds. In this fight, Frevola got hurt towards the end of the first round with, guess what, another 1-2 down the pipe, with the right straight cracking him on the temple. This wobbled him badly and led to Nelson following up with more shots and dropping him. Kyle Nelson then landed more and more ground and pound, with one of the shots seemingly putting Frevola out cold, which led to the ref stepping in to stop the fight. However, for some reason, the referee Dan Miragliotta then restarted the fight. So if it weren't for this blunder on Dan's part, Frevola would be on a 3-fight KO loss streak and would have 5 of his 6 pro losses coming by way of KO due to strikes on the feet. So yeah, that's my reasoning for his placement on this list. Now moving on to the guy in the number 7 spot, we have Andre Petroski. Some of you hardcore UFC ball knowers may already know why I have him at this spot on the list, but first I'll just go through his stats. Out of Petroski's 4 career losses, 4 of them are by KO or TKO. In the UFC, the first loss Petroski had was to Michel Pereira, where Pereira dropped Petroski with a straight right hand and finished him with ground and pound. And while the current Michel Pereira is a shadow of his former self, you can't forget that Pereira was ranked at one point and was on a pretty crazy finishing streak at the time. Michel has no cardio, but he does have explosive power, so getting KO'd by him doesn't mean that your chin is bad. However, what happened in Petroski's next fight is what made me put him on this list. In Andre Petroski's fight against Jacob Malkoun, Petroski shot in for a head-inside single-leg takedown, but instead of finishing the takedown, he wobbled around, dropped to the canvas, and collapsed. And well, what happened was that Petroski hit the side of his head on Malkoun's hip, knocking himself out. And that is what leads me to the conclusion that Petroski's chin is fried, because other fighters have survived getting literally dunked onto the canvas head first or slammed all the time. KOing yourself on your opponent's hip is a terrible sign because it means that you have to be extra cautious not only on the feet, but even in grappling exchanges from this point onwards to keep yourself from getting KO'd. And in his most recent fight, Petroski got slimed out in the first round by Cam Rowston with a couple punches, so the lack of chin durability is becoming a real trend in his career. And that is why Petroski is on this list. At the number 6 spot, we have Johnny Walker. And now some of you may be wondering why Johnny isn't higher on the list, but once we get to the guys who are higher up, you'll understand why. First, Johnny is at light heavyweight, where everybody hits pretty hard, so he really can't be at the top of the list. But the reason why I have Johnny here, and specifically why I think he has a worse chin than his fellow light heavyweight Dominic Reyes, is because of who Johnny is getting KO'd by. First off, Johnny Walker had 2 KO losses on the regional scene, with one of those KO losses being the infamous loss in Jungle Fight, where he basically got slept 4 times in a single fight. And yeah, getting KO'd badly on the regional scene by subpar competition is just a horrible look for your chin durability. The first KO loss of Johnny Walker's UFC career was to Corey Anderson, who is a power puncher and a top-notch light heavyweight, and the current PFL light heavyweight champion, so there's no problem with this loss, especially since this was a standing TKO. However, besides getting KO'd in the regional scene, the biggest reason why I have Johnny Walker up this high on the list is his flatline KO loss to Jamal Hill. And in this fight, Jamal Hill put Johnny Walker out badly, and it's the fight that convinced everybody that Hill was some sort of crazy power puncher. But here's the thing, ever since this fight, I think we've all seen that Jamal Hill just doesn't have crazy, mind-boggling power in his hands. In his title-winning performance, Jamal Hill beat a 43-year-old Glover Teixeira to a bloody pulp, but didn't knock him out or even knock him down. And back in the day, a much younger Glover was getting put out completely cold by actual power punchers like Alexander Gustafsson and Rumble Johnson. Yuri Prohaska absorbed everything that Jamal Hill threw at him and TKO'd him, and Khalil Rountree Jr. beat Jamal Hill up badly without taking any significant damage as well. And well, that Jamal Hill flatlined Johnny Walker. And then when you add on top of that how Walker got completely slept unconscious by both Ankalaev and Volkan Oezdemir, and as a bonus, there's also that video of Walker getting KO'd in sparring by a boxer who is probably 50 pounds lighter than him as well, which is why I placed Johnny here on this list. I also have a quick theory on why Johnny's chin is as bad as it is. As anybody who has watched Johnny Walker fight before would know, Johnny Walker is incredibly uncoordinated while in the cage. I wouldn't be surprised then if Johnny Walker just doesn't have the bodily coordination to properly brace himself against strikes, which is why he keeps on getting KO'd in such goofy ways. But anyways, on to the next. So next, we have Beneil Dariush, who I have here at the number 5 spot on the list. And now, I love Beneil, but his chin has just really regressed a ton at this point. I mean, his own coach, Rafael Cordeiro, openly spoke in 2024 about how, in 2023, Beneil got knocked down 3 times and knocked out twice, with 2 of those knockdowns and 1 of those knockouts happening in the gym, which is just a really bad sign. And if you look at Beneil's career, you would see that 6 of his 7 losses have come by way of KO or TKO. His 2 early KO losses, which included a flying knee KO loss to Edson Barboza, aren't a sign that his chin was bad. And if you've ever seen the Jaclar close fight, you would know that Dariush used to be known for taking a beating, getting hurt, and coming back to get the finish. But out of his past 4 fights, Beneil Dariush has been KO'd or TKO'd in 3 of them, although, as I'll get to soon, it's actually the one recent decision win he has that has made me place him here on this list. In the Charles Oliveira fight, Beneil was rocked and hurt with a head kick through the guard and a follow-up right hand, but we all know that Charles Oliveira hits really hard. But then, in the Arman Tsarukyan fight, Beneil was flatlined by a right straight that Arman threw after a feinted knee. And look, Arman does have good kicks and some good ground and pound, but he just does not have crazy power in his standing punches. But nevertheless, Arman Tsarukyan is a top-level fighter and one of the best lightweights in the world, so there's no shame in that KO loss either. But then, the main reason why I have Beneil here on this list is actually the Renato Moicano fight, which Beneil actually won by decision. In this fight, Beneil Dariush got dropped by Moicano. And now, Renato Moicano is one of the most pillow-fisted fighters in not just the UFC lightweight rankings, but the entire division. Moicano had 0 wins by KO or TKO prior to the Jalen Turner and Benoit Saint-Denis fights. And if you recall those fights, you would know that those were both a result of ground and pound, with Jalen Turner basically gassing out while Moicano wailed on him, and BSD losing by doctor stoppage after a cut. Renato Moicano just does not hit hard on the feet. And before any of you say, But Moicano dropped Makhachev. That was a slip, not a knockdown. Moicano hit Makhachev in the chest, not on the chin. When Moicano, a jiu-jitsu fighter and former featherweight with what are basically pillow fists, is dropping you badly, that's the sign that your chin is just completely gone. And the 17-second flatline KO loss to Benoit Saint-Denis just further cements this fact. And, well, I just hope he retires for the sake of his health after he gets executed by Quillan Salkeld. And now, speaking of Quillan Salkeld, here's a Quillan Salkeld victim at number 4 on the list, Jamie Mullarkey. Although, in their fight, Jamie Mullarkey got subbed by Salkeld, which may or may not have something to do with Jamie Mullarkey's complexion. But anyways, there are a few reasons why I have Jamie Mullarkey so high up on this list. He has 6 losses by KO or TKO throughout his MMA career, including a brutal flatline KO loss to Alexander Volkanovski back on the regional scene. And now Volkanovski does have some pop in his shots, but as you guys all know, he isn't some sort of crazy power puncher. For reference, Volkanovski has caught guys like Yair Rodriguez and Diego Lopez with similarly clean shots, but those punches just wobbled them and didn't knock them down or anything. Volkanovski is more known for landing a lot of volume, and he doesn't put guys out cold. Unless they're named Jamie Mullarkey. However, getting KO'd by a guy who went on to become a literal GOAT of the sport isn't bad. But do you know what is? Getting KO'd by Muhammad Naimov, a featherweight fighting up weight class, and getting KO'd by Nasrat Haqparast. And Jamie Mullarkey has also been used to make highlight reels for lanky strikers like Jalen Turner and Mauricio Ruffi. And part of the reason why I have Jamie Mullarkey all the way up here is because he is still only 31 years old, when a fighter is still supposed to have his chin. So yes, Jamie Mullarkey is here at 4th place because he's getting put out cold by guys who are volume strikers, and is getting repeatedly put out by guys who are essentially what amount to journeymen in the UFC. Now, at number 3, we have Niko Price. And in Niko's case, I'm just left to wonder why he's still on the UFC roster. He's lost 7 out of his last 10 fights, with 5 of those losses coming by way of finish. And well, if you look at who Niko Price is getting killed by, it's guys like Phil Rowe, who is no longer on the UFC roster, and Nikolai Veretnikov, who was 1-3 in the UFC when he TKO'd Niko Price in the first round and didn't win on Dana White's Contender Series. And then you have Price's almost instant flatline KO loss to Robbie Lawler in Robbie's retirement fight, which, while it was a feel-good moment since we all got to see one of the most fun fighters of all time go out on a KO win, it also just showed how bad Niko Price's chin is. The shots that washed up Robbie landed in the clinch didn't have a ton of wind-up behind them or anything, but they still put Niko out cold. And while Robbie did have a ton of KOs throughout his career, Lawler isn't exactly who you would think of when somebody mentions one-punch KO artist. In Niko Price's case, he's old, he's far past his prime, and his chin is really just completely gone since he's getting put away by the likes of Nikolai Veretnikov, who shouldn't have ever been in the UFC in the first place. And frankly, I think there's an argument for putting Niko Price higher up on this list, but I have my reasons behind why I've put the guys in the top 2 where they are. Taking home the silver medal in the worst chin in the UFC competition, we have Aaron Pico. Now, I like Aaron Pico. I think he's a very fun fighter, but man, he was getting flatlined by guys in Bellator. And frankly, I could just leave it at that. But if you don't know Aaron Pico's story, I'd really recommend looking into it because Pico was a very special Bellator fighter. He had an elite background in amateur boxing and wrestling, and was hand-selected as a potential future star for Bellator, which is why he made his professional MMA debut in what was at the time the second best MMA league in the world. And well, in his pro debut, Pico got dropped badly by an uppercut from Zach Freeman, who retired from MMA just a fight later and got submitted just 24 seconds into the fight. And in his fight against Henry Corrales, a fighter who lost to all of the championship caliber fighters in Bellator, like Patricio Pitbull and Juan Archuleta, well, Pico got brutally KO'd in the first round after an exchange in the clinch. And then, the fight immediately after that, Pico got knocked out again, this time against Adam Borix, who is a pretty solid fighter, but who has also lost against the best of the best in Bellator. And here's the thing, all 3 of these stoppage losses were in Pico's early 20s. Your 20s are when your chin is supposed to be at its freshest, at its best, when he should be able to take hard shots and keep going. But that just isn't the case with Aaron Pico. And as we saw in his ill-fated UFC debut, he got completely slept by Lerone Murphy with a spinning elbow, who is a really good fighter, but isn't really known for his finishing potential. And now, while I did say that getting KO'd by a spinning elbow doesn't mean you have a bad chin, I do want to use this KO loss from Pico to demonstrate that there is a difference in chin durability between fighters, and that it's not just bad defense or anything like that. John Silva, who has a ridiculous chin, got hit with more or less the same strike, a spinning elbow, during his fight with Diego Lopez, who is naturally a much more lethal fighter than Lerone Murphy. And while John Silva did get finished, he wasn't put out cold like Pico was. Diego had to land follow-up shots to finish Silva, while Pico was just completely out. And remember, Aaron Pico is fighting at one of the lighter weight classes while still not even being in his 30s yet, so his chin is only going to get worse from this point onwards. But anyways, before we get to the number 1 worst chin out of everybody in the UFC, let's talk about a few honorable or dishonorable mentions. First, there's Cody Garbrandt, who I actually think has a bit of an underrated chin. While Cody did go on that 3-fight KO loss streak to TJ Dillashaw and Pedro Munoz, I think that was more about Cody's bad defense than him having a genuinely awful chin. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still a bad chin, but if you go back and watch those fights, you'll see that Garbrandt got clipped while trading in the pocket with his chin way up in the air in every single one of the finishing sequences. And the only time Cody has gotten completely flatlined was against Pedro Munoz. In the TJ Dillashaw losses and the TKO loss to Kai Kara-France down at flyweight, Cody Garbrandt was either still standing or he was crawling around, and that was after he had gotten touched right on the button. When Cody Garbrandt isn't seeing red and is actually watching out for shots, he can survive some punishment, with the best example of this being him surviving a flush head kick to the temple in his most recent fight against Long Zhao. Cody also went to a decision against Rob Font, who isn't a crazy power puncher, but has put out truly chinny competition like Marlon Moraes and has finished decent unranked guys like Adrian Yanez. So yeah, I really don't think Cody is as chinny as everybody thinks he is. He was just very defensively irresponsible in that 3-fight stretch. Another name that has to be mentioned here, sadly, is Gilbert Burns, who never had an iron chin, but has been really on the decline recently, taking a tremendous amount of punishment in his fights with Usman, Hamzat, and JDM, and getting completely blown out of the water by Michael Morales. I also think that Bobby Green, who I will never call by his new legal name by the way, is somewhat chinny, but that is also partially due to him fighting with his hands down all the time, so it's kind of difficult to tell how bad his chin really is. And if you watch back his fights with Lance Gibson Jr. and Daniel Zellhuber, you could see that he was eating some shots straight on the chin, so it can't be that terrible, right? Another cheating fighter who didn't make the top 10 is Grant Dawson, who got TKO'd by Bobby Green with a straight left and got put out by Manuel Torres. But at least in the Torres fight, you have to consider the fact that Torres is a genuine power puncher with a 100% finish rate in the UFC. So I don't think we can definitively say that Dawson has a terrible chin just yet. Another fighter with a terrible chin is the Pride of India, the King of Lions, Anshul Jubli, who I put there in the thumbnail for the purposes of rage bait. And yeah, while getting sparked out by Quillan Salkeld isn't bad, getting slept by a single shot from Mike Breeden, who was literally winless in the UFC at the time, just shows that Jubli's chin is pretty damn bad. And the only reason why Jubli isn't in the top 10 is because, well, it's because he just hasn't been KO'd enough yet in his career, although hopefully that changes soon. As for the current heavyweight with the worst chin, that has to be Austin Lane, who has gotten brutally KO'd in 3 out of his 5 UFC fights. But as I said at the start of the video, I don't think getting KO'd at heavyweight means you have a truly terrible chin. And out of the current champions, I think that it's either Joshua Van or Volkanovski who has the worst chin. I say this because Van is a flyweight, and he got flatline KO'd by Charles Johnson as well as wobbled badly by Edgar Shires in their fight. And in Volk's case, he's been KO'd by Topuria and Makhachev, but Topuria has absurd power, and the Makhachev fight was on short notice, up a weight class, and Islam finished Volk with a head kick. And as for which fighter is the most susceptible to body shots in the UFC, I think I have to say that it is indeed Anthony Hernandez. We've seen him get finished twice with a knee to the body, once by Kevin Holland and most recently by Sean Strickland, and he also got badly hurt to the body by Michel Pereira in their fight as well. But anyways, let's now move on to the man in the number one spot, and I'm sure that many of you hardcore fans already know who I have here. The fighter with the worst chin in the UFC currently is far and ahead Matt Schnell. Despite being a flyweight, Matt Schnell has 5 losses by KO or TKO, and many of those losses were quite brutal. In his fight against Alexandre Pantoja, Matt Schnell got starched with a big right overhand, making him faceplant on the canvas. And again, in his fight against Mateusz Nicolau, Schnell got caught behind the ear and faceplanted again. And while Pantoja has some pop in his shots, he's not a crazy power puncher at flyweight like Manel Kape or Koji Horiguchi, and neither is Mateusz Nicolau. And just for some perspective, Nicolau's only KO win in the UFC was over Matt Schnell. And then there's the Sumer-Derji fight, where Matt Schnell had that crazy comeback win via triangle choke. However, before he got that win, he was getting dropped and wobbled and nearly finished by Sumer-Derji, who is a long and lanky point fighter, not a power puncher. And then there's the Steve Erceg fight, where Matt Schnell got flatlined completely out cold by a left hook from Erceg, like Schnell was completely unconscious. And since the Matt Schnell fight, Steve Erceg has fought 4 times and not gotten a single knockdown in any of those fights. And it's not for lack of trying, because in Erceg's fights against Alexandre Pantoja and Brandon Moreno, Erceg landed over 100 strikes at range in each of those. And if you recall Erceg's fight with Pantoja, which Erceg arguably could have won, you would know that he was landing much heavier shots than that short little left hook that he KO'd Matt Schnell with. Getting KO'd multiple times at flyweight by fighters who aren't power punchers just shows that you have a really, really, really bad chin. And that is why, out of everybody on the UFC roster, I have to say that Matt Schnell is far and ahead the chinniest fighter. But anyways, please comment your list of the chinniest fighters in the UFC down below. And thanks for watching, or more than likely, listening to this video while doing chores or playing video games or doing whatever else in the background. Goodbye.